Welcome to Luxoft Tech Talks, a series of podcasts in which IT gurus share their knowledge and discuss the latest trends and innovations in the world of IT. We are going to cover the most recent developments in the programming languages, frameworks, and technologies that are shaping the future of the software industry. This new format of online learning is part of Luxoft Learning Management and Development Services rebranding. Please share your feedback in the comments to let us know what speakers and topics you would like us to cover in later installments.
Hello, I'm Oliver Quick. I'm a PhD student at Aarhus University studying empathy and sympathy and human-robot interaction studies. Today I'll be talking about the challenges for designing sympathetic robots as part of a Luxoft technology series for YouTube. So the structure of the talk, first I'll talk a little bit about what a sympathetic robot is and why sympathy matters. Then I'll talk about the distinction between empathy and sympathy. I won't really be delving into empathy very much in this talk, but it is necessary to touch on it, both given the history of the concepts and the way they're used in HRI. Then I will focus in on how sympathy is used in HRI. And then I'm going to present a sociological theory of sympathy from Candace Clark that I think is sort of a very fruitful foundation upon which to create sympathetic robots. So what is a sympathetic robot? Well, very generally put, we could say that a sympathetic robot is simply a robot that simulates the social skill or competence involved in expressing sympathy. I would expand that and say that it's also programmed to follow the local social conventions of sympathy exchange. And what I mean by that will hopefully become clearer throughout the talk as I present Clark's theory. So the concept of sympathy has a very long history, which I won't be going into in detail, of course, but it really came to prominence during the Scottish Enlightenment through the works of David Hume and Adam Smith. As Hume said, or Hume believed that there's no quality of human nature that is more remarkable, both in itself and in its consequences, than that propensity we have to sympathize with others and to receive by communication their inclinations and sentiments, however different from or even contrary to our own. And Adam Smith also gave great weight to the importance of sympathy in a moral and social perspective in his work, Theory of Moral Sentiments. Candace Clark, the sociologist whose theory I'll be using today, argued or pointed out that sympathy is a crucial emotion that provides glue for social bonds, the building blocks of society. So why is sympathy important for robots? Well, sympathy is simply something that is very basic to human socialization. It's something we use every day. People sympathize with us, we sympathize with other people. We don't necessarily always display our sympathy or act on it, but nonetheless, the feelings are there, and we're sort of constantly involved in a give and take of sympathy. So if we want our robots to be integrated into society, they will need to simulate these capacities to some extent, at least. So what are some of the contexts in which we might want sympathetic robots? Well, if you think about it, there's actually a lot that immediately come to mind. For instance, nursing home caretakers, nurses, teachers, or just simply companion robots. If we have a robot that's taking care of an elderly person or an infirm person, as in these photos, most people would probably think that we want the robot to display some level of sympathy rather than simply being cold and mechanic. We don't need sympathetic robots for every context, simply for social contexts. For instance, an assembly line robot, it's pretty clear that it doesn't need sympathy unless it's going to be interacting with humans constantly and socializing. So other uses, advertising and sales. There's this study where they designed an iBones robot that exactly plays on people's sympathy to draw them in so that the robot can then give a tissue packet to the person, sort of a guerrilla advertising technique that's sometimes used. Another application, there are a lot of studies, there's a large body of research right now focusing on designing and developing or exploring the possibilities of sympathetic and empathetic robots as social mediators for autistic children, who can sometimes struggle to read the emotional states of other children or the people they're interacting with, and knowing the sort of social norms for how to display your emotions and when. And I would say generally, any situation that requires frequent or extended social interaction, especially if it's long-term interaction with the same user or users, sympathy is at the very least going to be a great boon for their integration and their acceptance, and possibly even a requirement for it. So I'll turn now to the distinction between empathy and sympathy. As I've said, I'm not going to dwell on this, but it is important to touch on it. So empathy, broadly put, is primarily focused on the internal state of another person, their mental state, whether that be a feeling or a belief or an intention. And empathy tends to be seen more in terms of an action. It's something you do, not necessarily consciously, but it is something you do primarily. Sympathy, on the other hand, really focuses on the situation of the other person and only secondarily on how they feel. And it's more along the lines of a reaction. It's something you experience. Of course, it can be directed intentionally as well. So the psychologist Wisp says that in empathy, one person reaches out for the other person, whereas in sympathy, the sympathizer is moved by the other person. Another psychologist, Paul Bloom, in his book Against Empathy, which I'll refer to several times, says terms like sympathy and pity are about your reaction to the feelings of others, not the mirroring of them. And that brings us to the distinction between two types of empathy, cognitive and affective. Cognitive empathy really focuses on understanding what someone is experiencing or feeling and making predictions about their future beliefs. It also goes by other names such as mind reading, mentalizing, perspective taking. I will not be really going into that, but as Bloom suggests, it's really about understanding that someone's in pain without necessarily experiencing any of that myself. So it's really about knowledge, knowing what somebody's experiencing. Affective empathy, on the other hand, is exactly about sharing their experience. So if they're in pain, you also feel pain. And there are also other terms for affective empathy or affect sharing, I've called it here, but it's also feeling with, state matching, isomorphism. But generally the idea is, as you can see from this list of requirements from Devignemont and Singer, you're experiencing affective empathy with someone if you feel sad, and that matches the sadness of the person you're empathizing with, and your sadness is caused by the observation or imagination of their sadness, and you're aware that that is the cause of your sadness. They later add a caring condition, which I don't include here, in a different paper. But broadly speaking, this is the distinction between cognitive and affective. Now, I'm going to turn to how empathy and sympathy are used within HRI today, as I've seen it. Most of, or almost all of what I'm going to present and what follows is in my forthcoming paper to be presented at the Robo-Philosophy Conference this year in Denmark. That being said, in HRI, you often see that the terms empathy and sympathy are simply treated synonymously. or even defined in terms of one another. And these are a few examples of studies that do that. Or oftentimes one or both of the terms is used without being explicitly defined. And that's not only in terms of, as a reader of the research, you're not provided a definition, but also for the participants. They're simply asked about empathy or sympathy and not told what is meant by it. Given the very long 200-300 year debate going on that is still going on with what these terms are, how they work, it's not clear, or it's actually clear that everybody doesn't have the same conception of what these are. So there's some danger in sort of assuming that we all think the same thing when we say sympathy or empathy. Another thing to consider, the affective cognitive empathy distinction is ignored lots of times. And that's important. There's a big difference between knowing that someone's sad and experiencing that sadness or sharing in it yourself. And as a final point, sometimes one or both of these concepts is linked to pro-social action or altruism, helping behaviors. And that's not necessarily a good thing, or at least a theoretically sound thing. And there's some inconsistency across the board on what people think. People are sort of just drawing on different theories, which is always bound to happen, but it's a little problematic when we're designing something that has as much potential impact as social robots, entities that will be in our homes, our nursing homes, our schools. So that's the first problem, the lack of conceptual clarity. Another problem lies in how we're quantifying or measuring empathy and sympathy experiences. And there are a lot of approaches to this, and there's not one that is clearly better than any other. I don't offer a solution to this problem because I simply don't have one. I'll mention at the end a little bit of what I think could be done, but it is a big problem, I think. So two of the standard measurements that are used are Mark Davis's IRI, the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, and Baron Cohen's Empathy Quotient, EQ. These are in and of themselves validated, interesting measurement scales for empathy, but they really touch on a lot of things that don't fall under sort of the common definitions of empathy. So they draw in related concepts. And as a consequence, you end up with a measurement not just of empathy, but empathy with sympathy. And I mean, affective and cognitive empathy with sympathy, maybe compassion, maybe just politeness. And so you get sort of a muddied result. It's a little unclear what you have at the end there. The other approach, in addition to sometimes using these standardized measurements or in position of using them, oftentimes people present questions like this. I think this scenario is sad, and you rate it on a scale, or I would have sympathy for someone in this situation. And in this study, and in actually all the ones I'll mention here, they're looking at empathy, and yet they ask directly about sympathy, which is simply not the same phenomena. It's related but distinct. And again, sympathy is not defined for the participants or for the reader of the study. How empathic was the robot's response? How sorry did you feel for the robot? Another study studying empathy, but feeling sorry for someone is more properly the domain of sympathy, not empathy. So what you get from this is not a measurement of how empathetic they felt, but rather a measurement of how sympathetic they felt. And you run into the same problem here. The problem overall with this sort of approach is that things like sympathy are being measured, but being put under the label of empathy. Then the research is presented as, well, this sort of scenario provoked empathy. Then someone else comes along and cites that research and has a footing on which to say, well, we saw that this type of thing elicited empathy, so we'll build on that. But they didn't really elicit empathy. They elicited, or they measured, they might have elicited both, but they measured sympathy. So what's really lacking here is simply a systematic account. So overall, focusing in on sympathy, there's a lack of conceptual clarity, as I've discussed. I should say it's not a universal problem, it's simply a prevalent one. There are, of course, exceptions. These are some examples of exceptions that I've come across, and I'm sure there are many more. Yet the problem is widespread enough that it is worth mentioning and doing something about. The second problem I discussed was the difficulty in measuring sympathy. And as I said, I don't really know the easiest way around this. I think Bloom's critique of empathy measures is exactly right. As I alluded to, most of the empathy measures used are actually measuring a cluster of things, including empathy, but also concern and compassion, as well as some traits that might have little to do with empathy in any sense of the term. And I agree with Bloom, having seen these. You can just Google empathy quotient and take the survey for yourself, and you'll see that there are many questions that just don't seem to have much to do with empathy. So given these problems, the only way forward I really see is that we need to base our research on a systematic account of sympathy. And I'm going to propose that Clark's account is a good one to use. Of course, that doesn't mean that I'm arguing that every researcher should adopt Clark's account. I've simply found it to be not only an interesting and profound one that captures some truths, but also one that lends itself to robots or robotic design. So before we get to Clark's account, we might ask, what is sympathy? I've been talking about it. I've defined what a sympathetic robot is, but I haven't really gone into what sympathy in itself is. So I'm going to just present a few different definitions. So WISP, again, says that sympathy has two parts: a heightened awareness of the feelings of the other person, and secondly, an urge to take whatever actions are necessary to alleviate the other person's plight. I would emphasize that the first point, it's really more about their situation, not their feelings, but that's one definition. Another from Stefan, an HRI researcher, he points out that for sympathy, it's not required that the affective states of the sympathizer are similar or isomorphic to those of the other. It's sufficient that they're in resonance. There's some sort of awareness and similarity, perhaps. And I would say not even similarity. There just needs to be secondarily awareness. It's about the situation. And he also points out that it's used to explicitly cover pro-social motivations. Bloom, again, says that sympathy and pity are about your reactions to the feelings of others, not the mirroring of them. If you feel bad for someone in pain, that's sympathy, but if you feel their pain, that's empathy. Clark offers a very general definition at one point from her book, Misery and Company, from 1997, which is the book most of this work is based on. And she says, sympathy refers to one person's feelings for someone else who is experiencing problems. Here you can see the situational focus. And in the paper I mentioned, define sympathy as an affective pro-social reaction to the negative situation of another, where the assessment of the negativity of the situation and what the proper response to that situation is governed by sociocultural norms. So now we turn to Clark's theory of sympathy, and she sort of founds this or grounds this theory in the emotional economy. And so there's a lot of economic metaphors throughout her work. I don't think that we should take things overly literally. I can't speak for her, but I think that the metaphor is a very good one. But especially when we get to some of the finer points in the next couple slides, we should keep in mind that it is a metaphor. It captures something about how it works, but it's not literal. So sympathy is a commodity in our emotional economy. That is, sympathy is a valuable good. It's not something that can be quantified. As I said, like commodities can be counted and a value can be assigned. Sympathy is not quite like that. But it is like a commodity in that it is a valuable resource like any other service or good. It costs the donor time, effort, and emotional energy. Sympathizing with someone is not always cheap in any sense of the word. Sympathy exchanges are governed by norms that evolve over time and that are relative to different societies, though some general principles hold, which I'll go into later. And sympathy itself carries value in light of its scarcity. We can't always act on sympathy. For instance, if you were to walk the streets of New York every day for 6 hours a day and give $2 or $3 to every single person you encountered that was homeless or was needing money, you would be out of money very quickly, unless you have large economic resources to draw on. And even then, it would not be sustainable over a long, long period of time. And that's just money, which is sort of a crass example. But if you think of emotional support, that also takes time, effort, and emotional energy. You can't always be there for everyone to the full extent that they need you to be there. We simply don't have the emotional capacity for that as humans. And sympathy rewards the recipient by symbolizing and building connection, offering reprieve, and confirming the sympathizee's social value. This last point about social value is very big in Clark's theory. And she also ties sympathizing to ascriptions of moral value. And that's something very similar to Adam Smith. He also ties sympathy to social and moral value. And in fact, sympathy is sort of a form of moral judgment for him, or tightly related to moral judgment. I won't be going into those aspects of the theory. What I pick up on here is this fact that sympathy symbolizes and builds connections. And that's exactly the sort of thing we'll need from our robots if we want them to have any sort of meaningful interactions with us over time. They need to build a connection. So two sort of foundational aspects of her theory are the sympathy margin and the sympathy biography. And these two are very tightly related. So the sympathy margin, again, remember that these metaphors should not be taken overly literally, but you can think of the sympathy margin as a line of credit that everyone has. And this credit varies between different people. So my sympathy margin with my sister is different than my sympathy margin with my friend, and that's different from my sympathy margin with my enemy, and so on. We all have sort of a socially relative starting amount. We draw on our margins when we need sympathy. And giving sympathy places an obligation or debt on the receiver. So receiving sympathy also places an obligation or debt on you. And this can sound very it lends itself to a self-interested type of theory and makes it seem like there's no place for altruism if you read it too strictly. But Clark was emphatically against that reading, and I am also. An obligation or a debt is not necessarily a bad thing. And we don't think about it consciously in these terms most of the time. But when someone supports you through a very difficult time, most people feel some sort of obligation to repay that. And there are many ways that this can be repaid, the simplest of which is gratitude. The margins themselves are continually negotiated over time, and that'll become clearer in the parts that follow. But that ties into the sympathy biography. So the sympathy biography, everyone has their own little biography of sympathy. And it's essentially just a history of your compliance and non-compliance with sympathy norms. Again, this biography is not something that should be taken as being written down and literal, but it's sort of a general awareness you have of how your friend has conducted themselves in the past. And this awareness plays into your inclination to sympathize with them in the future and in the present. The sympathy biography, however, is not private information. People talk. As Clark says, members of a network often know each other and discuss among themselves how much sympathy a given member has claimed and how much others have given. So if, for instance, you have a sibling who is always coming to you with a sob story and needing money, and you know that they're actually lying with their little stories that they constantly have, and you know that they're using that money for drugs. This is information you might share with your family such that they don't, fall into the trap and enable this person also. And you yourself will probably at some point stop giving them money so they stop buying drugs, ideally, though it doesn't always work out that way. But the knowledge of someone's biography affects your inclination to sympathize. And as I said, this knowledge is not private. It can be, but this is often something that does get discussed. So this will be important for social robots, and I'll come back to this shortly. I want to turn now to the sympathy norms that Clark worked out. Before I move on, this is the iBones robot, the advertising robot I mentioned at the beginning, which is intentionally sort of pathetic and weak by design, precisely to draw people in so that they will take the advertisement from them. So it plays on people's sympathy intentionally for advertising purposes. So Clark's research was done in the late 80s. She wrote a paper in 87, I think, 87. And she did a series of studies throughout the late 80s, 87 to 89. Then she developed this into a book in 97. And I'm using both of these sources, but primarily the book. For her data, she used a variety of methods to collect it. For one thing, she did sort of classic studies with vignettes, followed by interviews and questionnaires with about 1,200 participants in the US, 60 of which were children. For another thing, she did obviously a thorough reading of the academic literature of the time, as well as non-academic literature, including fiction and nonfiction. And finally, she used greeting cards as a source of data on how sympathy works in the States, which seems a little funny at first, but in the US, greeting cards really are a very common way of expressing sympathy. You send cards oftentimes. It's a big business, and for a reason. So all of that to say simply that she used a pretty broad data set to arrive at these norms. Nonetheless, while I think that the norms hold across cultures worldwide generally, it is important to keep in mind that this research was done in the United States, and it was done at a certain time, and the norms change over time, and they could be different or slightly different in different societies. These four that I'll present are very general though. So the first one is simply don't make false claims. This one should be pretty self-evident. The example she gives is of the boy who cried wolf from Aesop's fable. With lying, if you lie to somebody repeatedly and are caught in the lie, people stop trusting you. And the same works for sympathy. If you're constantly claiming false sympathy or falsely claiming sympathy, at some point, people will not want to sympathize with you anymore simply because they won't know if you really need it or not. And again, sympathy is something that takes time, effort, and emotional energy. So it's a valuable commodity. The second rule, don't claim too much for too long or for too many problems. This one, I think everyone has probably met someone in their lives or knows someone who sort of constantly fishes for sympathy. They present themselves as perpetual victims. They always have sort of a litany of problems. Or if it's not having too many problems, then they have the same problem which they simply never get over. Or they're constantly demanding too much sympathy from you. They want more always. And violation of this norm will lead to people not wanting to sympathize at all, sympathizing less, or simply offering very superficial sympathy, saying, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, that's too bad. So it's an important norm. She adds a corollary to this norm. Don't accept sympathy too readily. I'm not going to go too much into this norm because I think it's really a very American social norm, and I can't speak to how it works in different societies, but I suspect that it could be a less potent force. This is an empirical question, of course, and I'll touch back on that in a moment. The third norm is to claim some sympathy to keep accounts open. So if you never claim any sympathy from anyone or never accept it, you sort of cultivate this independent, self-reliant image, which is not necessarily a bad thing. That goes back to the corollary 2A. In the US, that's exactly the sort of image most people want. But if you go too far with it, if you never claim any sympathy or never accept any sympathy, then people won't see you as someone who needs sympathy ever. So when you do need it, people simply won't be ready to give it. It's not out of malicious intent, but it's out of the fact that you've designated yourself as someone who doesn't need it. And Clark suggests that people like this, if they really want sympathy, will eventually have to simply find a new network. I'm not sure that you couldn't change your image and open up and get the sympathy that way, but in any case, if you never claim sympathy, you designate yourself or you cut yourself off from the sympathy market. Finally, reciprocate to those who have given sympathy. This goes back to what I talked about with the obligations that come with sympathy. So if you never reciprocate in any way the sympathy you get, people will likely stop sympathizing or again offer superficial sympathy or simply sympathize less. And that's, I think, pretty self-apparent. I mean, the reciprocation of sympathy doesn't need to be of equal kind or weight or importance. If somebody gives you a gift of money to help you through a hard time and doesn't want repayment, it doesn't mean you need to sit and wait for them to need money so that you can give it to them. Perhaps all you need to do in that case is show sincere gratitude. In other cases, maybe all that's warranted is a card. In any case, there are many ways to express your gratitude or to reciprocate the sympathy, but it's important you do it to keep your margins open and viable. Otherwise, you'll be seen as ungrateful. And this exactly goes back to the biography, and it's the type of information that would get around. People would know that you're someone who doesn't ever repay sympathy. So people who violate these norms are what Clark calls sympathy deviants. And my goal here is to present, now I'm going to talk about how each of these applies to robots, and my goal is to, or the hope is that we can design robots that don't fall under the category of sympathy deviants. So one final example that may kind of illustrate specifically the reciprocation, the importance of reciprocation is, if you imagine you had a friend who every year for your birthday gave you the most incredible, perfect birthday present you could ever want, but they wouldn't accept any thanks, and they won't accept birthday presents themselves or Christmas presents or anything like that. They simply insist on giving you a perfect present and not letting you repay them. Over time, say over a decade, probably less, you'll reach a point where, or you would probably reach a point where it starts to feel insulting or degrading that they're not letting you pay back your sympathy, because the obligation they're placing on you is constantly growing and you're never able to chip away at it. It's like credit card debt. It just keeps growing and you're drowning in it. And I don't think people like that would be, of course, that's an extreme example of somebody, but it wouldn't have to be out of malicious intent. They could do it with the best of intentions, not accepting presents. But nonetheless, they're sort of deviating from the norms. They need to accept reciprocation. So the other side of these rules is that, not following them makes you a sympathy deviant. But there's also an aspect in which all of us are acting as gatekeepers of some sort, or rule enforcers. And that plays out in the sympathy biography mostly, I think. And the idea is that we're kind of aware of when somebody is a deviant, and we shouldn't be enabling that sort of behavior. For instance, with the perpetual victims, the sympathy fishermen, we don't want to always provide this person with what they need. For one thing, it's not healthy for them to enable this sort of behavior, just like it wouldn't be healthy to give a drug addict money anytime he needed it to go buy heroin. It's not healthy to always let them play that role for their sake. For another thing, it's not good for your sake or for the sake of other network members. You can be seen as a sap, someone who's just simply always ready to give everything, even when it's foolish. And it's not just about the image people have of you, it's also about your own well-being. So we kind of keep an eye on these people, and we're aware of when somebody is breaking the norms. And this is information that's likely to get around. So when we turn to the case of robots, we'll go through them one by one. Don't make false claims. Well, that's immediately problematic because we know that robots don't feel anything, and for the foreseeable future, they won't. So there's a sense in which any claim a robot ever makes to sympathy will always be false, simply because they don't need sympathy in the way humans do. Unfortunately, because of the third rule, they need to claim some sympathy to keep accounts open. There needs to be a balance in the relationship, more or less. That being said, there are ways in which the robot could claim sympathy that wouldn't seem false or ridiculous. I mean, it would be patently false and ridiculous to have the robot say, "I'm sad today because my robot cousin died." It simply doesn't make any sense, and it's very apparently false. Robots don't die because they're not alive, and they're not sad because they don't feel. But we could have the robot take different approaches. So for instance, Khan and others did this study in 2012 with a robot called RoboV, where they had participants play a game with a robot. Then, at some point during the game, a researcher, a Confederate, would come into the room and sort of interrupt the game, and then kind of rudely cut the robot off and be like, "All right, it's over, it's time to go, we're out of time, get in the closet," and be very rude and want to lock the robot up in the closet. And the robot would, in varying conditions, but the robot would sort of express that it didn't want to go in the closet. It would, I'm scared of the dark," or "please let me finish the game." Essentially, what the robot is doing there is it's playing on the sympathy of the participant. And what I think is important here, and the participants often stood up for the robot, said, let him finish the game, at least. But what I think is really important there is that that claim is not actually that ridiculous for the robot to say something like, I don't like the closet. I don't like being in the closet. That's an example of something that could elicit sympathy without being so overly ridiculous. Or another one might be, my battery's really running low. I'm feeling tired. Could you please plug me in? Even something like that could elicit a bit of sympathy. And that might be sufficient to satisfy the third rule while still not being ridiculous. The second rule, don't claim too much for too long or for too many problems. That's simple in the case of robots claiming sympathy, because the challenge is actually in figuring out clever ways for them to claim it, right? So I don't think them claiming too much or too often is going to be a big problem. The other side of it, the enforcement side, is a little bit more problematic. This is where I think there's really a big danger with sympathetic robots, one of many, and that's that robots need to be able to recognize, to some extent at least, when somebody is deviating from these norms and somebody is abusing, taking advantage. They shouldn't, just like we don't enable, or we don't want to enable, we don't want others to enable these perpetual victims, the robot shouldn't do that either. It's not doing the person any favors. And for another thing, along those same lines, because of the sympathy biography, we know when people are receiving, oftentimes, not always, but we oftentimes know when someone's receiving sympathy from somebody else. If the robot's playing that role, why should I offer my sympathy? Because they're having their needs met, at least mostly or partially, perhaps sufficiently to satisfy me, by the robot. And my sympathy is a valuable resource. So why should I spend it if somebody else is already spending it? I might just offer less. So there's a sense in which here the robot runs the risk of cheapening sympathy if it's always ready to sympathize to the full extent over anything. Or you could look at it in terms of making human sympathy, human to human sympathy, so valuable that we're less inclined to give it when robots are available. For instance, if I had an elderly relative that I'm not particularly close to in a nursing home, and they sort of constantly wanted attention and sympathy from me, but then they're introduced to a robot and the robot is always there for their problems, then I might start thinking, well, I don't need to pay quite as much attention to this person. And of course, this is an empirical concern. This is something to be investigated, but I do think it is something we need to consider and sort of worry about a little bit at least. Finally, reciprocation to those who have given sympathy. Easy enough for the robot to say thank you in a somewhat sincere way. It doesn't necessarily have to be thank you in a flat robotic voice. It could have a variety of ways of expressing gratitude. If it was a companion robot, it could do something special or do something extra beyond what it normally does. And accepting gratitude is important too. The robot needs to be able to graciously accept gratitude. So what I particularly like about this structure is that these norms sort of lend themselves to programming to some extent. I'm not a programmer, but they all seem like things that could be used as guiding principles, and the robots could be trained along these lines with data sets to follow these norms. Another thing that's promising about these norms is that they're very general, other than corollary 2A. They're really very general and probably hold across most societies, certainly most Western societies, such that it gives us a really good foundation on which to start building sympathetic robots. When it comes down to the local level, there are going to be differences, and I'll go into that in a little while. So a final aspect of attributing or sympathizing with someone is luck. And this is going to be a challenge for robots. We assess people as needing sympathy, not just by the norms and by our seeing the situation as unfortunate, but also in terms of bad luck or responsibility or blameworthiness for the situation. So if you think somebody is responsible for being in the bad situation they're in, you're less likely to sympathize than if they're simply unlucky. And this is something Clark found throughout her studies. So she says, applied is unlucky when it's not the result of a person's willfulness, malfeasance, negligence, risk-taking, or in some way bringing it on him or herself. Again, it's important to remember these studies were done in the US. I think generally this idea holds, but this is something that could vary in terms of what constitutes bad luck and what constitutes blameworthiness will likely vary to some extent between societies. So we might imagine two heroin addicts who have recently suffered an overdose and are alive still, we'll say. One of them is the child of very wealthy, loving parents who did everything possible to give him a good life. And you know, he simply was a risk taker and he was reckless and he went down this road and he had his overdose. He clearly lies more towards the responsibility side of the spectrum. We can say that the other person came from an abusive household raised by a father who abused him and, you know, in extreme poverty and was introduced to drugs very young. For instance, I myself met someone once who started on heroin when he was 12 because his older brothers were selling it and they simply wanted him to keep quiet and out of the way. So they started dosing him with heroin. I think most people would agree this is really a bad luck situation. The kid didn't know what he was getting into, right? So he's not nearly as responsible as the other young man. And we tend to sympathize more with the victim here than the blameworthy person. Clark uses an example of a couple that buys a house on a beach in a hurricane area, and their house is destroyed by a hurricane and they lose everything. She found that people sympathized more or less depending on whether they thought the couple was responsible or whether it was simply bad luck. This falls under what Hochschild calls framing rules. People framed the situation differently, and then they felt differently about it. So some people thought, well, the couple was negligent in buying this house where they knew there were hurricanes. Maybe they should have taken out a big insurance policy, or maybe they should have simply bought a house in a safer area. Other people thought it was just bad luck. You couldn't have known the hurricane was going to come today. You couldn't have known it was going to come in 10 years. It might never have come, or it might not have destroyed your house completely, right? So depending on how people frame it in terms of bad luck or responsibility, blameworthiness, we're more or less likely to sympathize. So then the question is, can a robot attribute luck and responsibility? I think this is an obvious challenge for a robot, but maybe not impossible, again, with sort of training on what type of scenarios we decide are bad luck and which ones are responsibility or blameworthiness. The framing is critical here. And I'll come back to that in a moment because it comes up again. So the final sort of area I want to touch on from Clark's theory is what she calls sympathy entrepreneurs, and then a problem that I call ideological imperialism. So a sympathy entrepreneur is someone who pushes the limits of our concept of who deserves sympathy. We might ask if robots can or should or would do this. If you look back, not even very long back in history, you can see that today we sympathize with things that we didn't used to. And you can see a bigger and bigger gap the farther back you go. Clark uses the example of lepers in biblical times. It was a novel concept to start sympathizing with them. just as when another more recent example, the AIDS crisis in the US alone, I'm speaking about. But initially this was seen as not a very sympathetic cause by most people. Most people thought, well, it's only homosexual men who engage in very risky, reckless practices. But through the work of advocacy groups and as awareness grew, people realized, well, that's not the case. Some people are born with it. Some people take precautions and get it by accident. You can't simply lump everybody into being blameworthy over this. And even then, some people aren't blameworthy. For instance, in the UK, not long ago, there was a case of a man who was intentionally spreading HIV. His victims, and they are victims, are definitely worthy of sympathy, even though they have AIDS, which a while back would have been seen as sort of their own fault. Mental illness is a similar thing. You don't even have to go very far back in American history, unfortunately, to see where people who suffered from mental illness were sort of pariahs, problems to be hidden away, often treated with aggressive, invasive surgeries, lobotomies, shock therapies, and so on. And nowadays, there's a lot more sympathy for these people. If you go back 500 years, an issue like depression is not something that would be taken very seriously or sympathized with too much, whereas today, it's a problem that is widely acknowledged and does garner some sympathy. And it's taken seriously. And this is, again, because of these entrepreneurs, these individuals and groups, and sometimes simply social shifts. We might ask then, where can robots fit into this picture? And this turns us to the problem of what I call ideological imperialism. So for me, this is the biggest risk that I've come across in social robots generally, though I think sympathetic robots pose a particular danger here. So the idea I have in mind here is the risk of enforcing our ideas on other cultures. So if we design and build a sympathetic robot in the US, following sort of Clark's norms or some other system of sympathy, we still have to, whatever system we use, we still have to give the robot an idea of what merits sympathy and what does not. It can't simply sympathize over everything. It wouldn't make any sense. It has to know when somebody is sharing something that merits sympathy, right? But the things that merit sympathy not only vary over time, but they vary across cultures. And they vary within cultures as well. There are lots of subcultures in the US. And it's not just what merits sympathy, but how that sympathy should be expressed, what's appropriate for that setting. And this can be very different. So you can imagine that in the United States, what merits sympathy and how that should be expressed could be very different in some cases than in Iraq or Japan or Mexico or even Denmark. In any case, my worry here is if we design and build this robot in the US and give it our ideas of what should merit sympathy and what shouldn't, and then we go plant it down in a very different culture, there's a double risk. If we do that and we implant it with, this is what merits sympathy, that doesn't, and then we put it in a culture where there are different ideas, we run the risk of trying to enforce our ideologies, our ideas of what's sympathy worthy on a different culture. And it's not clear we have that right. So I'm going to take a drastic example, but let's imagine spousal abuse, wife beating specifically. If we were designing a sympathetic robot in the US that, would be it would be socializing with people, we would probably want the robot to sympathize with the victims and not the abusers, right? And we might even want the robot to not only offer sympathy, but perhaps offer some advice to the victim. Maybe say, this is a contact number for people who can help you, things like that. However, while that may be a good idea in the US, there are some societies in which that would not necessarily be a good idea. I hate to say that. I think most people, or many people, would agree that, you know, spousal abuse generally is a bad thing. But if you take a robot that's going to sympathize with the victim, and even worse, if they're going to advise or try and help them, and put it in a society like that, there's a sense in which you're taking your culture's ideals and trying to impose them on another society. And as I mentioned, it's not clear we have that right. It's also not clear we don't have that right. We might even have that responsibility. The problem is, who decides where to draw the limits and which things the robot should take a stance on, right? Right now, it would be teams of programmers and engineers, sometimes psychologists and philosophers. It's not clear who has the knowledge, the wherewithal, the right to make these sorts of decisions, if anyone at all does. So not only does the robot have to be tailored to the society, we have to take a lot of care in making sure that we're not being imperialistic and planting our ideological flag. On the other hand, if we don't take a stance on some issues, such as wife beating, to continue with the same example, or even more drastically, something like genital mutilation, then there's a sense in which the robot could be seen as legitimizing or supporting the existing ideologies. So if the robot doesn't sympathize with the victim, if it doesn't offer sympathy, then it's sort of tacitly agreeing with what's happening, right? And this, for me, is especially worrisome if it's around, say, children. Because now the children see, not only do they have people who are, you know, they're adults who are accepting it to some extent, more or less, but now they have a robot that also seems to accept it. So that we're simply giving another support to an ideology that we may not want to support. And I don't know the way around this. I don't know the solution. As I said, I think it's a double-edged sword. If the robot doesn't take a stance, then it seems to legitimize or support the existing ideologies. If it does take a stance, I mean, there's really only two ways it could take a stance. One is to explicitly support the ideologies, which I think in a case of genital mutilation or spousal abuse, most people would not want to do, or the opposite, which is to sort of undermine them. And again, it's not clear who has the right, if anyone, to do that. So to sort of summarize, I've covered a lot of things today. I started talking about the problems with sympathy usage in HRI and also with empathy. I talked about the lack of conceptual clarity between empathy and sympathy. And this extends also just generally to compassion, pity, perspective taking, emotional contagion, affective and cognitive empathy I mentioned, but all of these are interrelated phenomena which are simply not distinguished in most studies to a sufficient extent. Then there's the measurement problem, which is directly related. We don't have an easy way to measure any of these phenomena, much less to target one of these phenomena. That's not to say it's impossible, simply that I've seen a lot of studies that don't take the type of care necessary to get at exactly what they're trying to measure. And I gave some examples of or I listed some of examples of studies that do that earlier. Overall, I see that there's simply a lack of a systematic approach to what sympathy is. I've proposed Clark's theory as an approach that I think could be very fruitful for designing sympathetic robots. Of course, this is not to say that everyone should adopt this theory, but I do think that if you're going to be working in this field, it really is important, if you're going to be designing a sympathetic robot, it's important to know what sympathy is and to have it firmly grounded in a sound theory. And all of the concepts I mentioned from Clark, you know, as I mentioned, these are sort of founded theoretically and empirically in the US and at a specific time. So I would say that all of this needs further empirical and theoretical research, but I do think it's a great starting point for robots. And I just hope to see a little bit more consistency and care taken with the use of these concepts. And that ties into the last point I talked about, ideological imperialism, which I think is really probably the biggest risk I've seen for social robots, and most especially for sympathetic robots. And even more so when you consider the ties between sympathy and ascriptions of social or moral value, which I haven't gone into here, but there is a pretty solid foundation of support for thinking that there is a tie between sympathy and moral value ascription or social value ascription. Clark for one, Smith, Hume to some extent, and others. So overall, I've talked about some of the challenges. I've offered very few solutions. I think, for instance, the problems in HRI, there's not an easy way forward. I think, you know, Clark's theory offers a good starting point. What's really needed is more in the wild studies. Unfortunately, most robots simply aren't there yet, so that's not a viable solution. In any case, I've presented the problems that I'm aware of. I hope that this talk has been at least somewhat informative and interesting. Thank you for listening. I'm Oliver Quick.